package that prevented depression, expanded and modernized unemployment insurance programs, elimination of pay discrimination through the Lilly Ledbetter and equal pay laws, bailing out the auto industry and protecting unionized retirees and workers, protection of stem cell research, reversal of the Bush ban on funding for overseas planning, and what John Judas in the New Republic calls a quiet revolution. That is a new environmental policy with leaders devoted to a return to scientific administration, a strengthened EPA willing to act in default of congressional action. Now, all this before comprehensive healthcare reform and financial regulation reform rivaling the legislative achievements of FDR. Obama and his policies should not be immune from criticism by his liberal constituency. There have been failures and missteps, but neither should the liberal base be immune from criticism. It seems incapable of imagining how radical Obama is being made to seem to those on the other side of the political spectrum, and of how formidable the individualist, anti-big government ethos is and always has been in American politics and culture on the left as well as the right. Think Jefferson, Paine, Thoreau, and Emerson. Roosevelt, we should remember, had the advantage of grassroots support of the left. Now grassroots energy has its source on the right. So my main complaint against Obama's liberal critics is their eager disposition to find fault and to dismiss or deride his accomplishments. As I say in Dissent, liberal disenchantment with Obama and the apathy that accompanies it only helps the Republicans and does a disservice to its own cause.
Thank you. There are 2 seats up here. If there's anyone brave enough to come to the front who wants to sit down for the rest of it. And I believe there's 1 seat over there. And there's two right there. So, yeah, I know some people do like to stand. But anyway, okay, our next speaker is Julian Zelizer, who has written for our website. So some of you may have read him on there, and we hope we'll have him in print fairly soon too. He's professor of history and public affairs at Princeton University, the author of many books on American political history, most recently Arsenal of Democracy, The Politics of National Security, from World War II to the War on Terrorism. And this fall, a triple header, he has 3 books coming out. One on Jimmy Carter, so you can expect to see him on all the talk shows. And book on Jimmy Carter, Conservatives in Power, the Reagan Years, 1981 to 1989, with Meg Jacobs, and an edited book on the presidency of George W. Bush, a first historical assessment. He's also a well-known commentator in the media and has a weekly column in CNN.com. So, Julian.
Thanks. So I wanted to pick up on a few of the points that came out in the article, and some of the things. My article touched on the tensions between liberals and Democrats, and looked a little at the Jimmy Carter, Ted Kennedy relationship, which frayed and became, I think, very problematic for Carter. And look at some of the problems that President Obama might face and respond to a few of the points. I must say, in general, I agree with most of the points raised, that this is clearly a president who has done a lot, and often the expectations are higher than I think our political system will produce. And so it is a president who's in a very difficult position. But I do think there's been problems that have emerged with liberals that deserve some attention. The first is Obama's relationship with the left. And while the frustration from liberals might result from excessive expectations, there's clearly a problem there. And this reminds me a lot of Ted Kennedy and Jimmy Carter, who by the end of his first year, Ted Kennedy, who really represented the liberal wing of the party, felt isolated from the administration and felt as if he was on the outside. I think we've seen the administration potentially make a few mistakes in the first year. clearly there has been a tendency of the White House to shut out key voices in the liberal community. We've heard this, for example, from the African American community that met recently in Chicago and expressed great frustration that they have had very few meetings with the president, and the African American agenda has not been something that the administration decided to take up. We've also seen something of a failure to capitalize on the 2008 campaign. That was one of the great promises of the administration, that you finally did have a moment where there seemed to be at least some electoral energy that was comparable to what conservatives had done over the past few years. You remember the famous phone numbers when he announced his vice presidential candidate, and how they were going to use that. And there's been little evidence that this president has run some kind of grassroots operation during the period of governance. And some might say that has been a problem as well. I do think that the president has also left liberals in a precarious position. Early on, he went for a stimulus package that was smaller than many liberals pushed for. He did need the Senate votes, clearly, of the centrist Democrats. But we shouldn't take that to say that the number he ended up with was the right one. There were many critics who said that the stimulus would not do enough to really pick up the economy. There were critics of the substance of the stimulus, not having enough money for state and local government, rolling it out too slowly, not having enough in terms of public works projects. And at the same time, he handed Democrats and liberals very controversial issues, including health care. So he now leaves Democrats facing a mobilized conservative base, uneasy centrists and moderate voters, and at the same time jobless figures that makes it hard for liberal Democrats to go back to their districts and gin up a lot of enthusiasm. A second issue is I have a little bit of a difference on kind of the transformative presidency. I do think President Obama made a stronger promise as a candidate. In the primaries, he positioned himself against Hillary Clinton, explicitly arguing against the kind of incremental, gradualist politics that President Bill Clinton had promised. Now, this isn't whether which is better or which is worse, but I do think, in fact, he's often practiced a kind of Clintonian politics, and there is a relationship between how you campaign and how you govern. And it could set up certain problems in terms of the expectations of voters. A third issue is the role of liberals. I think on some of his victories, it's not that Obama has been victorious with progressive legislation, which he has, but liberals in Congress have been quite instrumental to those victories. I mean, the story of health care, according to at least the early accounts we have, depended heavily on Speaker Pelosi pushing back against the administration after Scott Brown's victory and saying, we're going to go through with this. Rahm Emanuel wanted to break up the bill into a much smaller package, and Pelosi and liberals in Congress said no, that the costs would be too high. So that's an example where we have to be careful in terms of how we think of how that legislation worked. You know, Howard Dean, who came out against it, in the end changed his position. But part of the reason he did that was Andy Stern, kind of one of the key labor leaders, called him up and said, this is too costly to try to tell our supporters to oppose. So we have to be cautious not to write liberals out of some of the victories that we're talking about and see the importance that they have in his presidency. Fourth, the evaluation of policies. He's had a lot of big wins, but I think it's too early to see kind of what's going to happen with this legislation. I mean, the story of old age insurance is that between 1935 and 1950, that program almost disappeared. It was a total disaster. Politically, most Democrats and Republicans were not certain whether it would survive. In 1950, one of the top administrators said it's nip and tuck to see if old age insurance, which is what we call Social Security, is going to last. Benefits were meager. Most people were in another program called Old Age Assistance, which was more a welfare model. And the funding mechanism of Social Security was on the verge of being gutted. In the end, it was saved, but there were 15 years where that program wasn't very important and could easily have fallen apart. And we have many examples